Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is January 7th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about Part 4, examination of the Book of Numbers between the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox canon and the King James Version. Now, Numbers is not a book about wandering. It is a book about what happens when a delivered people struggle to trust freedom. The events do not change between the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record and the King James Bible. The people complain, leaders fail, fear spreads, judgment occurs. The question this examination tonight asks is whether the language used to tell these events shapes God as reactive and angry, or as patient, corrective, and consistent while governing a fragile people. Now, this episode exists because Numbers contains some of the most emotionally charged scenes in Scripture. Complaints are punished. Plagues break out. The wilderness becomes a place of loss. Now, depending on how these moments are worded, God can sound provoked by irritation or responding to breakdown of order that threatens the survival of the community. So line by line, this examination places the same passages side by side to see whether God is heard as lashing out at weakness or restraining chaos while preserving a future he has already promised. No motives here are assigned. No behavior is excused. The words themselves are allowed to teach what kind of authority is being exercised. Numbers ultimately answers whether God abandons his people when they falter, or whether he continues to shepherd them even while correcting them. How that shepherding is voiced determines whether believers learn fear of failure or endurance under discipline. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Surfer Wife. Surfer Wife says, "Hey family, happy hump day." It's Wednesday? You know, it was weird. Last year just went by in a blip, and this year is going to do the same. Soon it's going to be December 2026, and we're going to be like, what happened? Number two warrior says, "Hey, James. Hey, warrior fam. What's going on, Scorpion? Glad you're here." And that's it. It looks like either I'm early or some people are late. Let's get straight into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
So tonight's field of headlines shows a world under escalating geopolitical pressure. Gee, what's new? Not random events, but a tightening grid of authority, resource control, legal dispute, and moral narrative shaping. The top story is Venezuela, of course, remains the dominant geopolitical flashpoint as President Nicolas Maduro and his wife were captured in early January by U.S. military and law enforcement forces out of the blue and are now in U.S. custody facing federal charges related to narco-terrorism, sure, and trafficking. Now, which Maduro actually denies, right? Look, I said this as a comment on one of our listeners on, I can't remember what, but saying things about, hey, it's not about drugs. I go, yeah, I get that too, but every single country does drugs, deals drugs, makes money on drugs. That's a big power grab. And drugs control people because it makes them completely dependent upon the state. So to think that Nicolas Maduro it was just all about oil. That's not really true, but it is. It's true that we're there for the oil for America's future to save the US dollar, but we're not there for the drug money that Nicolas Maduro was making while being the head of that state. Now, the operation was called Operation Absolute Resolve, meaning it had to be absolute, and they had to resolve this like right now, or the dollar goes bye-bye. And it marked one of the most direct U.S. military actions in Latin America in decades. So it's not like we've never done this before. And President Trump has publicly said the U.S. will assert influence over Venezuela's future. Well, in New World Order terms, this underscores how dominant powers may operationalize legal and military tools to restructure governance and access strategic resources like oil. We're just going to go in and take it in front of the world, just like what Israel did in Gaza. Instead, Trump didn't kill women and children like Israel did. Go look it up. Now, for the children of God, discernment here is very crucial. True liberation is not defined by who holds the reins of power, but by dignity and well-being of people caught in the crossfire of great power rivalry. So pray for the people. Don't start yelling and getting angry at Trump or Maduro or China or whoever, because that's not going to help. But what will help is praying for the people of Venezuela. Global reaction to the Venezuelan operation is sharply divided worldwide at the United Nations. Many nations, including China, Russia, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and others, condemned the U.S. strikes as violations of sovereignty and international law, calling for peaceful dialogue instead of force. Well, that sounds like they pussied out. China explicitly demanded the release of Maduro and his wife, framing the U.S. action as a breach of international norms. Well, where were you when we invaded Iraq? We had no reason of being in there. Now, in New World Order terms, this reveals a fracturing international consensus where power and narrative collide. And for believers, this moment calls for prayer and peace, and for leaders to pursue justice without trampling the rights of nations and peoples. Believe it or not, we have the power to pray this away. I kid you not. We have to pray that nations get liberated from evil. We have to pray that the leaders of those nations repent. I don't know why nobody does it, but in the Bible, both canons, Ethiopian and King James, they say, pray for your leaders. Regional unrest is spilling into Colombia. Mass protests erupted in Colombia against the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, with demonstrators decrying foreign interference and demanding out with the Yanks. Good luck, as we're the new Britain. Regional anger highlights how actions meant to secure strategic advantages can fuel broader instability. Well, in New World Order terms, unrest often follows military footprints, even when framed as liberation. The more you protest, the more they're going to clamp down on your protests. For the Christian walk, sorrow for violence must coexist with prayer for reconciliation, not polarization. Now, the United States is repositioning energy strategy under a broader geopolitical doctrine now. President Trump has articulated that some analysts are calling a modern Donroe doctrine aimed at reasserting U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Could it be? Oh, yes. We're going to take it all. We're going to get Greenland. We're going to get Canada. And Mexico's next. You don't think it's coming? Trump said he's getting them. It might be a different year come 2028 when America has more resources, more power, more control. Now, as part of this, the U.S. may import significant Venezuelan oil, diverting it from China and reducing Beijing's influence in the region. That's a calculated move in a global energy chess match. Now, this wouldn't happen under a Democrat president. Why? Because Democrat presidents work for China. So naturally, they won't mess with Venezuela. And there are a lot of Democrats who are very angry right now at Trump because, well, they're not getting their paychecks now from China. And that's just the truth. Remember, as I've said before, America is divided between the Orsini clan, who control the Federal Reserve, and the Lee family, which control the BRICS. And the BRICS nations just so happens to control the Democrat National Committee. How did that happen? It started with George Bush Sr. Go do your research. In New World Order terms, energy is definitely leverage first, especially oil. Since we lost Saudi Arabia, we needed another source and we grabbed it. No more worrying about the US dollar anymore. Now, for believers, Christians, real people who care, this is a reminder that stewardship of creation is biblical. But control of energy becomes a tool for power only when hearts trust systems over providence. So Trump's golden age just may come because we now control Venezuelan oil. And I know of maybe some of you have seen the new president of Venezuela as she first got sworn in, and then the first 3 people she kissed and hugged were diplomats from China, Iran, and Russia. Interesting. And they were all going like this, oh, please come back. Not much they can do unless they blackmail her. Well, that's what governments do. U.S. legal and congressional questions are mounting now. Despite Trump's assertions, members of Congress and legal experts are questioning the lack of congressional authorization and the broader implications of seizing foreign leaders to face trial. Well, where were you, Congress, when we went into Iraq? They were doing the same thing. Oh my God, we're questioning the lack of congressional authorization. Yeah. They ain't going to do shit. There's nothing they can do. Why? Is because, well, thanks to Bush Sr., he gave the president a lot of executive office powers. And thanks to Bush and thanks to Obama and Clinton and Trump, they all gave themselves a lot of, executive powers. Executive orders. So, in essence, Trump could do whatever the crap he wants. And everyone's going to cry spilled milk, but it is better for our economy. I hate to say it, but it's true. Now, I didn't say it was a good thing. I'm just saying it's better for our economy because we're backed by nothing. We are a fiat currency. Fiat means ain't jack shit back in that piece of crap dollar, except for now Venezuelan oil, which used to be Saudi Arabia. Despite Trump's assertions, members of Congress are pissed. And they're talking about broader implications of seizing foreign leader and to face trial. And these concerns are not only about legality, but about how power is exercised without clear accountability. Well, remember when he was in his office for the first 4 years? Maybe you shouldn't have fucked with him like you did then. And maybe he wouldn't have gotten so bold to just piss you all off. Because that's pretty much what happened. In New World Order terms, legal ambiguity becomes a tool for force without consequences and consensus. Now, for the Christian journey, you guys, don't say the F word like I do. But submission to God's justice is necessary, not expediency. And honoring law and human dignity is what us Christians are supposed to do. We're also supposed to honor the country that we're in, even though the country that we're in is pretty much the den of thieves. Robert Gertison and Boots just made it out. Let's give a shout out to Boots and welcome everyone. Class is in session with your host, the voice of Rebels Airwaves and creator of Elite Potion, James Carner. And if we could all hit that thumbs up button, that would be great. Yeah, Rumble doesn't care much about my show, but they do care when you hit the like button. So if you could do me a favor, hit that X and then hit thumbs up. All right. And then, because I just did it. I'm the first person to like the show. Then go back to live chat and you won't lose your spot. Number 3, 4 Warriors, Robert Curtison saying hi, everyone. Number 6, no, we already did, no, Surfer Wife. It says drugs and human trafficking. Yeah. Well, that's money. There's money in human trafficking. And John Balls is here. Welcome, John. Long time. He says, Venezuela, the head of the Leviathan is the Venezuela. Remember that, guys? The Venezuela. No, I do not know. Oh, you mean the head of Leviathan, the dragon, and the head. That's interesting, John Balls. I'm going to do some research on that. That makes a lot of sense to me because the head of the dragon is right at the edge of Venezuela. And if that's the case, then, well, the dragon would be under the control of the Orsinis now. That's what I'm looking at because Trump took over a country in a few hours, unlike Israel, who continued to kill women and children. China's response to the Venezuelan operation has strategic undertones as Beijing condemns the U.S. intervention, but analysts suggest China may see opportunities in contrasting itself with unilateral U.S. action. The strike may bolster Chinese narratives of defending sovereignty and carve out ideological space for Beijing's influence elsewhere, even while Beijing hedges against direct confrontation. In simple terms, China's fucked. In New World Order terms, rivals do not always counterattack directly. Sometimes they reposition and narrate. But for believers, the calls for prayer, discernment, and how narratives of justice and sovereignty are wielded by global powers is important. We need to pray. Pray. Pray without using the F word. Venezuela-linked dark fleet oil tankers are stirring naval tension, as reports indicate a Venezuelan-linked oil tanker evaded the U.S. Coast Guard pursuit by reflagging it under Russia. They put a Russian flag. Oh, quick, it's a Russian flag, with Russian naval assets escorting it afterwards. A move that highlights how sanctions avoidance and geopolitical alliances are reshaping maritime reality. Russia isn't in a good spot, and neither is China after we took Venezuela. And they know they don't have the power to just come after us, so they have to take a big step back, lick their wounds, and take the last remaining tanker because we could kick their ass if they come here. And sure, whatever. They could push the button. We could all push the button. But even in reality, we've had that button since the 60s, 50s. Nobody's been pushing it. So why now? In New World Order terms, control of supply lines and resource becomes a strategy, not commerce. And for the children of God, it's a reminder that earthly networks of influence are woven with power and persuasion, not always with transparency, as we've seen with the Trump administration when he said, first, we're going to stop the drug cartels. And then he said, we're there for the oil. Other world headlines today include localized events and recovery efforts. Flood recovery efforts in Indonesia and Southeast Asia are underway after recent natural disasters hit millions of small businesses. I don't want to say natural. We've got the weapons. In New World Order terms, disasters often accelerate centralized responses and broaden governance, claims under humanitarian guise. So, the more shit hits your town, the more they're going to slap on surveillance because you said, help me. And they go, sure, we'll bring you food and water, but we're going to control your ass. Well, I'm not doing it. For believers, Christians, response flows from compassion first, followed by careful stewardship of how assistance frameworks evolve. And domestic U.S. news includes ongoing debates over immigration and law enforcement actions. Recent headlines highlighted another fatal shooting involving a U.S. immigrant agent and continued public debate on domestic policy and governments. When you shoot a U.S. immigrant agent, more surveillance is coming. In New World Order terms, guys, domestic volatility reflects broader pressures that systems feel when legitimacy is contested. Now, for Christians, Stability of society is rooted in justice and mercy, not coercion and fear. We know where all of this nasty shit's coming from, and it's the devil! Cultural and informational pressures continue to intensify as across society's debates over identity, narrative authority, and truth all remain central as information ecosystems become battlegrounds in and of themselves. In New World Order terms, narrative control is the quiet architecture of influence, especially online when we have AI that can, steer our thoughts. For believers, the call remains steadfast. Cling to revealed truth. Resist co-opted narratives and love thy neighbor in word and deed. We're going to go to a quick commercial. When we come back, we are going to talk about the book of, Numbers. Yes, the book of Numbers.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law, but the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight, that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedisassociations.com now and become tax-free.
All right, we're back to the show, and yes, it's about the book of Numbers. We are doing part 4 of a 66 series examining the book of Numbers, the King James Version versus the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox canon. And we're going to be examining the tone and the words and how they're viewed in the Ethiopian language and how they're viewed in English and Hebrew. And I'm telling you, for the past 4 nights we've been doing this, plus an explanatory show about how Ethiopian language is completely different than English. And so when you read it as an Ethiopian, understanding Ge'ez, you don't see an angry God. So there are certain phrases and wordings that still remain, but a lot of words have been changed and a lot of phrases have been changed. But combined, it gives us a whole nother picture of God, where the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox 5th, 6th century scrolls that I translated from that to English, from Ge'ez to English, paints a very merciful, loving, wonderful God who explains himself before he destroys everything, versus the King James pay-to-play, toll booth Jesus. Now, Numbers is what we're getting at here. And I approached Numbers, the book, knowing it is the book where many believers quietly decide whether God is patient or dangerous. I remember reading Numbers for the first time as a sober Christian, and it really scared me. It just again, here's this angry God. How am I ever going to please this God, And after reading Numbers, I kept thinking I had to be holy. Well, the New Testament says Jesus was holy for you, so you don't have to be. That doesn't mean go out and sin. It just means that with Jesus working with you, with the Holy Ghost inside of you, you naturally become holy. It's not anything about your works, because if you boast your works, then you're not holy, period. So faith without works is dead, is what James was trying to say. But what it truly is If you're a true Christian and you love God and you learn that he's not an angry God, then you fall in love with him and you become holier just through the nature of the relationship versus trying to be good, because trying to be good doesn't work, at least doesn't work for me. And this is where freedom meets fear, where promise meets resistance, and where leadership is tested under strain. Now, I read Numbers in full, the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record alongside the King James Bible. And I wasn't looking for different events, but I was listening for how God's response to weakness is carried through language. Now, Numbers does not introduce a new God. The people introduced here are the same people delivered in Exodus, standing under the same covenant given at Sinai. What changes is their emotional state. They complain, they fear, they resist, they fracture. And because of this, the way God's responses are worded becomes decisive to the listener, to the seer. And language here determines whether correction sounds like divine irritation or measured governance of a fragile community. Now, this book contains some of the most severe moments in the Torah. Fire breaks out, plagues occur, the earth opens up, leaders are corrected publicly. An entire generation fails to enter the land. Now, these realities exist in both records. What this examination asks is whether the words teach that God lashes out at human weakness or whether he restrains chaos while preserving a promise that fear cannot erase. Now, most of Numbers aligns cleanly across both traditions, the Ethiopian and the King James. God continues to guide, provide, and remain present while correcting, even while correcting. And the people are never abandoned. Leadership is never withdrawn without succession. Blessing continues to be spoken even when judgment occurs. Now, these patterns actually matter because they reveal whether God's authority collapses under frustration or remains coherent under pressure. This episode exists because Numbers has been used to teach believers that failure provokes divine anger. That complaint invites destruction, and that God's patience has sharp limits. Well, that's not true. When language leans towards rage and impulse, fear becomes the lesson. When language preserves sequence, restraint, and consequence, endurance becomes the lesson instead. And we will compare side by side the Ethiopian wording and the King James. Now, I'm not excusing rebellion here. Okay, these people, they were all black magic Satanists when they left Egypt. I'm talking about the Jews, the children of Israel. They left Satanism to get into a relationship with God. And I'm not excusing rebellion, and I'm not softening the consequences because they were stiff-necked. And when God even showed up there live and they could feel the presence of him, they still didn't want him. Now, I am asking whether the words themselves, the words, teach that God governs like an offended ruler or like a faithful shepherd dealing with frightened people who have not yet learned how to trust freedom. And what follows is not an interpretation layered onto the text. This is a side-by-side comparison. The same scenes will be read side by side where the words match, nothing will be added. Where the tone shifts, the shift will be allowed to stand on its own. I leave it up to the reader and the viewer to make their own conclusion. Now, Numbers is not a book about wandering aimlessly. It is a book about learning to walk with God while carrying fear, failure, and responsibility. Something that we don't have anymore, responsibility. There's a death of it, especially personal responsibility. And how God is heard speaking in these moments really determines whether believers learn to endure correction with trust or shrink back under the expectation of anger. This examination also exists so that discipline can be heard as guidance, not rejection. And so that believers can see whether the God who promised to bring his people into the land ever stopped being faithful when the people themselves struggled to believe him. We're talking about the difference between the Godfather, where you kiss his hand, bow to him, or God the Father, whom loves his children. But when his children disobey a direct order and they know not to do it, well, he has to do consequences. Now we're going to learn Now, Numbers opens with organization, not accusation. Before complaint, rebellion, or judgment even appears, God establishes order among the people. He goes, these are the things you need to follow. Simple things. Stop lying. Stop killing. Oh, man. Stop committing adultery. Oh, dude. Yeah, just 10 simple shit that they could not follow. And they had to sacrifice their own animals. Well, by the time they got to here, they were out of animals, they were starving, and they were eating manna. And this is what we're looking at, God establishing order among the people. Now, the way this act is voiced, the way the thing's voiced as you read it, really determines whether God is heard as exerting control or exercising care over a large and vulnerable community. Now, in King James Bible, Numbers 1:1-3 reads, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation, on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel, after their families, by the house of their fathers, with the number of their names, every male by their polls. From 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel. Thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies." Now, the language is administrative and militarized. Take ye the sum, number them, and by their armies can sound like preparation for control or conflict. Now, read devotionally, under an angry God, the census can feel like God reducing people to numbers for warfare. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same passage reads, "And the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, Count the whole assembly of the children of Israel by their clans and their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male one by one, from 20 years old and upward, all who are able to go out to serve. You and Aaron shall register them according to their divisions." Now, the difference is subtle, but very important. Count replaces take the sum. Register replaces number. Serve replaces go forth to war. Division replaces armies. The act remains the same, but the tone shifts from conquest to simple organization. This distinction matters because it shapes how believers understand God's use of structure. He's always getting us, counting us, and preparing us for war, isn't he? Well, in the King James wording, order can sound like preparation for domination. In the Ethiopian wording, order sounds like stewardship of responsibility within a community. Both records affirm the same reality. The people must be organized. Roles must be assigned. Readiness matters. Nothing about accountability is removed here. But what differs is whether God's first act in Numbers feels like mobilization for violence or preparation for survival and inheritance. Now, for believers, this opening quietly teaches whether God sees people as units in a system or as named members of a whole. The Ethiopian emphasis on names and registration preserves identity within order, rather than dissolving identity into function. Numbers does not begin with punishment. It begins with care. A large, fearful people in a hostile environment cannot survive without structure. And how that structure is voiced determines whether believers hear God as controlling or as organizing life so it does not collapse. So before complaint even erupts and judgment appears, God counts his people. Whether that counting feels cold or careful depends entirely on how the words are carried. And the next segment turns to the blessing God commands to be spoken over the people. Before complaint intensifies and judgment appears, God establishes how he wants his presence to be heard. Now, the wording here determines whether divine favor sounds conditional and fragile or declared and sustaining. In the King James Bible, Numbers 6:24 through 26 reads, "The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord makes his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace." Now, the language here is formal and elevated. Read devotionally, the blessing can sound like a pronouncement that may or may not remain depending on obedience. The tone is reverent, but distant, leaving space for believers to wonder how easily the blessing might be withdrawn. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same blessing reads, "May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and show you mercy. May the Lord turn his face toward you and grant you peace." Well, the shift really lies here in posture. Protect replaces keep. Show you mercy replaces be gracious unto thee. Turn his face toward you replaces lift up his countenance. The blessing sounds relational and active rather than ceremonial. This distinction matters because the blessing governs how the people interpret everything that follows in Numbers. If blessings is heard as fragile, judgment later feels like withdrawal of favor. God got mad. If blessing is heard as protective and relational, well, correction later sounds like discipline within care. Both records affirm the same truth. God desires to bless, protect, and give peace. Nothing about favor is removed. What differs is whether blessing feels like a formal state that can be lost or an active posture God maintains toward his people. Now, for believers, this passage quietly teaches whether God's face is easily turned away or intentionally set toward them. In moments of failure, later in Numbers, this blessing becomes the interpretive lens. Either God has abandoned them, or he is correcting them while still facing them. Numbers does not begin by warning the people of loss. It begins by commanding that blessing be spoken over them continually. How that blessing is voiced determines whether believers expect abandonment when discipline arrives or trust that peace remains God's intention throughout correction. Before any rebellion is punished, God declares peace. And that declaration frames the entire book. Whether it sounds conditional or sustaining depends entirely on how the words are carried. The next moment in Numbers where unrest breaks into the open, the way this incident is voiced determines whether God is heard as reacting emotionally to irritation or God responding decisively to a breakdown of order that threatens the entire community. In King James Bible, Numbers 11:1 through 2 reads, "And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. And the people cried unto Moses, and Moses prayed." Now, the language here is immediate and emotional. It displeased the Lord. His anger was kindled, and fire consumed. Create a sequence that can sound reactive. Like he was just sitting up there one day until they started complaining. It's like, "That's it, motherfuckers!" Well, read devotionally, the passage can suggest that complaint itself provokes divine anger quickly and severely. Now, get this. In the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, and it's Orthodox, the legalistic part of Ethiopia, the same passage reads, "When the people spoke in complaint, it was evil in the hearing of the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and fire went out from the Lord and burned among them at the edge of the camp. And the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed before the Lord, and the fire ceased." The fire didn't come down and burn them. It was at the edge of camp. No, God lit a fire. And the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed. Hey, then the fire ceased. Now, the difference lies in the framing here. The Ethiopian wording does not emphasize divine irritation. It describes the complaint as destabilizing rather than offense. The fire appears as response to disorder, not as eruption of temper. Its location at the edge of the camp preserves precision rather than indiscriminate destruction, as the King James Bible doesn't tell us where the fire was. Now, this distinction here matters because it shapes how believers interpret complaint. Oh, if you complain against the Lord, he's going to throw down a lightning bolt. In the King James wording, complaining can sound like a personal offense against God that triggers anger. In the Ethiopian wording, complaint sounds like a corrosive force that destabilizes communal order and must be halted. I'm not saying that their complaints were bad or good, and I'm not saying what God did was good or bad, but he didn't kill anybody at that time. So what differs is whether God is heard as emotionally provoked or as correcting a dangerous rupture before it spreads, giving them warning saying, guys, you continue to complain. I've given you food when you sacrificed all of your cattle because you had, every time you sinned, you had to sacrifice one animal, and we had millions. You had millions. They're all gone. Now you're eating manna. I gave you water from a rock. You're getting everything you need, and you're still complaining. They were even saying, like, in Numbers, they were saying, like, are there not graves in Egypt that we could lay in? I mean, we're all going to die out here. No trust in God whatsoever. Now, for believers, this passage quietly teaches whether fear of speaking honestly should dominate faith or whether unrest itself is the danger of being addressed. One reading can silence the heart out of fear. The other teaches that disorder has big consequences, but intercession remains effective. Now, Numbers does not present a God who cannot tolerate weakness. If you read it from the Tewahedo version, it presents a God who intervenes when chaos threatens to consume the whole. Meaning, when a few start murmuring, then they all start murmuring. That's like a little leaven leavens the whole lump, meaning just put a little bit of yeast in, that sucker will rise. Well, the whole thing will rise, and they'll go against God, and they'll go kill each other or kill other people, and then God could never fulfill his promise to them. The fire does not burn the camp, it burns at the edges. And the detail matters as it preserves this whole thing in the Ethiopian wording. Now, this moment sets the pattern for what follows. God does not ignore breakdown. He does not abandon the people. He responds, stops the spread, and continues leading. Whether that response is heard as anger or as restraint depends entirely on how the words are carried. Don't you think? I believe so. Now, the next passage addresses leadership, challenge, and correction. The way this moment is voiced determines whether God's authority is heard as humiliating retaliation or as precise intervention meant to preserve order without dismantling the relationship. In King James Bible, Numbers 12, 1 through 2, and 9 through 10 reads, "And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian women whom he had married." Isn't that interesting? Moses married an Ethiopian woman. Ethiopia, I love you. "And they said, hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. And then he departed. And the cloud departed from..." I'm telling you, dude, we got duped. The King James is just this angry freaking God. "And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And the cloud departed off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow." Now, the language emphasizes anger and sudden affliction here, right? You're like, dude, the father, just, you keep him away. You know, I'll stick with Jesus, but not this dude, you know. But read devotionally under an angry God, the sequence can totally sound humiliating and abrupt, as though leadership challenge provokes immediate punitive response without explanation. Surfer Wife says, "Let us know when you have downloaded the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox so eye-opening." Oh, you want the original Ethiopia, just wording, the original Ethiopia canon that I used to, I keep forgetting to upload it. You're going to have to email me, Surfer Wife, to remind me. I'll forget. Just email me at jamescarner.com. Now, the language emphasizes anger and sudden affliction. Angry God. Read devotionally, the sequence can sound humiliating and abrupt. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same passage reads, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, and they said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord withdrew from them, and the cloud departed from the tent, and Miriam was struck with leprosy white as snow. Now, the difference lies in agency and tone. Withdrew from them replaces anger was kindled. And this action is relational rather than emotional. The consequence follows loss of alignment rather than eruption of wrath. It also doesn't really, it honestly doesn't even say that God gave her leprosy. She just became a leper. It doesn't say that, and then God gave her leprosy like King James Version. So the Ethiopian version just says, after God departed, she became a leper. So they all assumed, well, that was God. White as snow. So the difference here lies in agency and tone. Withdrew from them replaces anger was kindled. The action is relational rather than emotional. The consequence follows loss of alignment rather than eruption of wrath. Earlier in the chapter, Numbers 12, 6 through 8 in the Ethiopian record clarifies God's reasoning. Not so with my servant Moses. With him I speak mouth to mouth clearly and not in riddles. Now, this explanation precedes consequence, preserving order rather than surprise. You start to understand how God has a relationship with Moses through the Ethiopian canon, but you don't through King James. And this distinction should matter because it shapes how believers understand correction of leadership. In the King James wording, challenge can sound dangerous because it risks provoking anger. He's a God who can't control himself. And in the Ethiopian wording, challenge is addressed because it disrupts appointed order. Because when one person hurts the tribe, the whole tribe gets hurt. And God is trying to protect those people from hurting the tribe. Period. And both records affirm the seriousness of the offense. Nothing is excused. Miriam is struck and Aaron pleads for her, but what differs is whether God is heard as emotionally reactive or structurally corrective. We don't even know much about this Miriam when it comes to the King James Version, because who is this woman? Why is she speaking with Aaron? Aaron and Moses are the top 1, 2. They're the number 1 and number 2 of the entire tribe, the top of the top. Who's this Miriam chick? Just shows up and then speaks for what, other sections of the tribes of Israel? So for believers, this passage often determines whether authority feels fragile and easily offended or stable and clearly defined. This woman could have done some horrible things to the children of God if God did give her leprosy, and maybe gave her leprosy so she couldn't use her talents of persuasion or push God's people back into Satanism. Now, one reading can teach fear of questioning, yet the other teaches respect for structure while preserving space for explanation. Numbers does not show God lashing out to protect his ego. It shows God protecting order so leadership does not fracture. And this was fracturing at the top of the top with some woman coming out of the blue barking offense. Not saying it's just women, it's just a woman. I'm not talking about women in general. Now, how that protection is voiced should determine whether discipline sounds humiliating or instructive. Miriam's affliction is not permanent. Restoration follows intercession, and that outcome reveals the purpose of correction. Now, whether believers hear that purpose depends on whether they hear anger or withdraw in the initial response. Now, the next section where Fear reshapes destiny. The report of the spies and the resulting delay define an entire generation. How this moment is voiced between languages determines whether the wilderness years are heard as divine punishment imposed in anger or as consequence flowing from collective refusal to trust God. In the King James Bible, Numbers 14, 1 through 4 reads, "And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And they said to one another, 'Let us make a captain, and let us return into Egypt.'" Later in Numbers 14, 22 through 23, the King James records God saying, "Because all those men which have seen my glory and have tempted me now these 10 times, surely they shall not see the land which I swore unto their fathers." Now, the language here is final and declarative. Got it. Read devotionally under an angry God, the outcome can sound like a sentence imposed in frustration. The wilderness years can feel like punishment assigned rather than future forfeited. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same events are voiced, but with different emphasis. Numbers 14, 1 through 4 reads, "And all the assembly raised their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. And they said, 'Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt.'" Now, the rebellion here is identical. Fear is explicit. Nothing here is softened. But Numbers 14:23 in the Ethiopian record then reads, "They shall not see the land which I promised to their fathers, because they have not trusted me." That's gone from the King James Version. The difference here is subtle, but it's really decisive. And you would miss it if you weren't paying attention. The outcome is tied directly to trust, not God's irritation to their murmuring. Hey, you guys, I don't know how many times you've just continued to say, "Lord, we love you, and we're going to devote our time to you, and thank you for this manna, thank you for the water, thank you for us and our future kingdom." And then the next night they're like, screw the Lord, singing songs about how they want to create a golden calf. They want to have an object that doesn't move, that can't look, read, think, or anything, and they want to worship that instead of God, who was in their presence this whole time. There's a big difference here, guys. But the way the Ethiopian canon says it, like Surfer Wife says, it truly is almost comical. Like, we have been sold a bill of goods through Rome, and Rome really changed the wording and used Latin and used English and used even Hebrew, just as language-oriented law instead of refinement and corrective information, as the Ge'ez language truly is. And I've told you guys, the Ge'ez language, it survived the flood. That's what Noah spoke. That's what the Ethiopian canon tells us in all those books that Rome took away, which was 1/3 of the canon, which ironically 1/3 of heaven fell. Now, the difference here is subtle, but it's decisive. The outcome is tied directly to trust, not God's irritation. The delay is not framed as God losing patience, but as the people making themselves unable to receive what was promised. This distinction matters because it shapes how believers understand failure. In the King James wording, the wilderness can feel like exile imposed by anger. God's mad at us. Screw him. He's angry. Well, in the Ethiopian wording, the wilderness feels like the inevitable result of refusing to step into what was offered. They really did not want Moses as God. They really honestly wanted to just worship Moses. They wanted a king, which you'll find out in 1st and 2nd Kings. Both records affirm the same truth here. The generation does not enter the land, period. Nothing about consequences removed. And what differs is whether God is heard as punishing fear or honoring man's choice, even when it leads to loss. That's what they wanted. It said the entire camp murmured. We don't like this God. We want to go back to Egypt. What's God doing? Oh my God. How can they be so thick-necked? Now, for believers, this passage often determines whether delay is interpreted as divine rejection or as consequence of mistrust that God continues to work within. One reading can teach despair after failure. The other teaches endurance and hope for future generations. You got to understand how they were before they left Egypt. They got everything they wanted immediately because they were not worshiping God. Sure, they were going through the actions of, our father is Abraham, and he has many sons, and many sons love Father Abraham, and I am one of them. But dude, that's what they did on the surface. But underground, dude, they were sacrificing children. They were sacrificing to Baal and Moloch. They were doing all Egyptian worship. They were magicians. They were witches, warlocks. And God wasn't going to give them instant gratification that they were getting in Egypt. And see, what they really wanted is they wanted to rule Egypt. They didn't want to leave it. They wanted to rule it because they thought that their Bible said so. So they felt misled by Moses going into the desert, and God is trying to teach them humility through love. And they're just not getting it because they are used to they're used to their God giving them instant gratification, instant riches, instant power, instant authority over people. And God isn't that way. He is a loving Father, and he is going to walk you through these pain and this heartache, and they just didn't want it. Now, Numbers does not present God changing his promise. The promise still remains. What changes is who is able to receive it. The Ethiopian wording preserves this without turning God into a source of the loss. This passage teaches that fear can forfeit opportunity without erasing covenant. And how that lesson is heard depends entirely on whether the word emphasis, punishment imposed, or consequence revealed. And don't forget, they went out of Egypt with 2 million cattle and sheep, 10 million, like oxen, cattle, sheep, millions and millions and millions of animals, okay, which can breed and have more animals. And they had all the water they needed, all the food that they needed, but they sinned so much, they killed all of their, because they couldn't follow just 10 simple commands. Don't kill people. Don't lie. Don't cheat people. Don't say someone did something when they didn't, which is bear false witness. They could not stop being evil because they loved it. It was their hearts that was the problem. Surfer Wife says, I am thinking Rome wanted to portray God as angry, so we would have to go to the elders or a priest to talk to God. So comical and sad, too. Oh, yeah. God doesn't want you to talk to man and confess your sins to man. That's just not right. Well, he does want us to talk to each other and, convey with our brothers and sisters, convey and say, hey, I did these things, open up, get it off your chest, and then repent. And then go set it right. Do the right thing. Don't hide in your sins. Now, this next passage is one of the most severe in the entire book. Now, Korah's rebellion challenges authority at its foundation. And the response really determines whether God is heard as violently suppressing dissent or decisively preserving order to prevent total collapse. Here we go. In the King James Bible, Numbers 16:31-33 reads, And it came to pass, as he had made an end of the speaking of all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah. And they, and all that appertained to them, went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them. Now, this language is dramatic and absolute. It scares the crap out of you. You feel like you're going to meet Korah one day because you're such a sinner. But the earth swallows them, and they descend alive into the pit. Now, read devotionally under an angry God, the event can sound like sudden annihilation delivered without any restraint. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same moment reads, When Moses finished speaking these words, the ground beneath them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and took them in, with their households and all who belonged to Korah. and they went down into Sheol, and the earth closed over them. Now, the difference is subtle, but meaningful. Took them in replaces swallowed them up. Sheol replaces the pit. The action remains final, but the language is less grotesque and more juridical. I always want to say jurisdictional, but juridical. And the earth functions as an agent of separation rather than a devourer. Now, earlier in the Ethiopian record frames the reason in Numbers 16:30, as the Ethiopian record says, if the Lord creates something new and the ground opens its mouth and receives them, then you shall know that these men have rejected the Lord. And if you read what Korah did in the Ethiopian canon, you'll see that they completely just defiled God and they rejected the Holy Ghost. They wanted Satan, Baal, Moloch, not Yahweh. The emphasis here is not silencing dissent, but on revealing the rejection. The act exposes alignment, not merely punishes opposition. This distinction totally matters because it shapes how believers understand authority. In the King James wording, rebellion can sound like it provokes catastrophic retaliation. In the Ethiopian wording, rebellion is exposed as self-removal from the order that sustains life. And this actually, the Ethiopian canon proves that the God of the Old Testament is true and he's not Satan. Many people believe that the God of the Old Testament was the devil. It's not. We were painted through words, through phrases, and through language, this angry God, which helped Rome control people. Both records affirm the seriousness of the act of what Korah and his camp did. Nothing is softened here. Korah's rebellion ends decisively. But what differs is whether God is heard as violently eliminating challengers or as allowing a fracture to manifest fully so it cannot spread again. For believers, this passage often determines whether questioning authority feels existentially dangerous or whether rebellion against order is understood as inherently destructive. One reading can teach fear of inquiry, and the other teaches respect for structure without fear of annihilation. Numbers does not show God defending his ego. It shows God preventing chaos from consuming the entire community. Korah wanted to take control, and he wanted to worship Baal and Moloch, and he wanted to take the children of Israel back to Egypt. And the earth does not open arbitrarily either. It opens to contain a rupture that would otherwise spread. What do you do when there's a line of fire and the line keeps going this way? You dig a hole to stop the fire from going into the direction that you want it to go. That's what God did. This moment is not about crushing dissent. It's about preserving life by removing a fracture that threatened to unravel the whole. How that preservation is voiced determines whether believers carry terror from this story or discernment about the cost of rejecting order. Korah and his camp hated God. They didn't want to worship that God because he just wouldn't give them all of their riches right away, just like Satan did. But you know what? God did. When they left Egypt, they had all of their gold, all of their silver, and all of their animals, livestock, and food. They walked out of there with 80 pounds of jewelry on each person. They took it all. God gave them everything they wanted, but it just wasn't enough because, well, they live in the desert. They didn't have Egypt. That's what they wanted. And they wanted Egypt's God. So this next passage concerns Moses himself. It is one of the most emotionally charged moments in Numbers because the one who has led faithfully now fails publicly. Oh. The way this moment is voiced really determines whether God is heard as unforgiving toward human weakness or as consistent in upholding trust and order, even with his closest servant. In the King James Bible, Numbers 20:7-12 reads, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. And Moses lifted up his hand, And with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land. See, God said, Moses, just speak to the rock. You don't have to hit it. Okay, I'll speak to it. I totally forgot. I want to show that I'm doing it. That's pretty much what happened. But the emphasis here falls on failure of consequence. Read devotionally under an angry God, the passage can sound abrupt and severe. One act appears to erase a lifetime of faithfulness, and given the impression that God responds to emotional lapse with permanent rejection. Well, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same passage reads, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will give its water. And Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff, and water came out abundantly. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not trust me to show my holiness before the children of Israel, you shall not bring the assembly into the land. Now, the difference, there doesn't seem to be. Very subtle, but it lies in emphasis, in the wording, believed me not, because that's what the other one said. It becomes, did not trust me. Well, the issue is not anger or disobedience alone, but breach of trust and representation. Moses did it because he wanted to get the glory for it. So instead of speaking to the rock, he hit it twice to show everyone his power. No one knew that. Well, the difference here lies in the emphasis. And Moses' acts, really, it was a breach of trust. And the frustration came rather than alignment with instruction. So this distinction should matter because it shapes how believers understand leadership failure. Because he did. Moses thought he was doing right by smacking it a few times. And God said, dude, all you have to do is speak to the rock. The rock's there waiting. Its ears are open, and you hit the rock. The rock didn't ask for you to hit it twice. Not saying that's the real reason, but Moses wanted to show force because they were murmuring. They were being little whiny bitches. Now, this distinction matters because it shapes how believers understand leadership failure. In the King James wording, the consequence can feel punitive and final. In the Ethiopian wording, the consequence is tied to role integrity rather than worth or relationship. Now, both records totally affirm the same outcome. Moses does not enter the land. Nothing is softened here. But what differs is whether the loss sounds like rejection or reassignment within a larger purpose. Language matters. Now, for believers, this passage often determines whether failure ends calling entirely or alters responsibility while preserving relationship. One reading can teach despair after mistake. The other teaches humility and accountability without abandonment. Numbers does not portray God turning on Moses in anger. It portrays God guarding the meaning of representation before the people. God didn't want Moses to get angry and hit the rock because that doesn't represent God. Moses remains God's servant. He continues to lead. He continues to speak with God. And the consequence does not erase the relationship. And you wouldn't know this if you would read the angry King James Version. Angry God, toll booth Jesus. So this moment teaches that leadership carries weight. Not that God is unforgiving. How that weight is voiced determines whether believers fear being discarded after failure or understand that trust and alignment matter most when representing holiness before others. Because Moses made a mistake. He wasn't holy before others. And remember, in the Ethiopian canon, we find out that they did it against him, 10 times? In the King James Bible, it doesn't even say that it took 10 times before God said, okay, I think it's time we address this issue. See, God is merciful. He lets them continue to murmur and continue to make mistakes. After the 10th time of basically trying to straighten them out, he had to do something. Consequences come. But the King James Bible, it makes it read like it just comes instantly. God didn't give them 10 times. See what I'm getting at here? Don't shout me down because I'm preaching good. This passage brings judgment and healing into the same moment. The way this scene is voiced determines whether God is heard as punishing rebellion or cruelty with cruelty, or correcting behavior while simultaneously providing a means of restoration. The next passage here, King James Bible, Numbers 21, 5 through 6, it reads, "And the people spake against God and against Moses, and the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of the people Israel died." And much people of Israel died. Now the language is abrupt and severe. God is heard as sending danger directly, and death follows immediately. Read devotionally under an angry God that we've all been worshiping, the passage can sound like swift retaliation for complaint, reinforcing the idea that frustration provokes lethal response from the Father. And later in Numbers 21, 8 through 9 in the King James, it reads, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live." So healing comes, but only after death has already occurred, which can make the sequence feel punitive first and restorative second. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, Numbers 21, 5 through 6, it reads, "And the people spake against God and against Moses, and serpents came among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died." The difference here lies in agency. The Lord sent. Ethiopian canon did not say the Lord sent it. It just says serpents came. The danger is present in the environment rather than framed as a weapon deployed in anger. Rome added, "The Lord sent." The outcome is still serious, but the tone shifts from attack to exposure. There are snakes in places. There were snakes there. They came. Didn't mean God sent them. Let me follow up. Numbers 21, 8 through 9, in the Ethiopian record, it reads, "And the Lord said to Moses, Make a serpent and set it on a standard, and everyone who is bitten and looks at it shall live." So the snakes came. Could have been sent by the devil. He had the keys to death and hell. He most certainly had the key, the ability, as how he treated Job, to make the winds move and send fire from the sky. Why can't he send serpents? You see how the devil is in the details? The act of healing is framed as instruction rather than countermeasure. God responds by providing a way to survive what has already been unleashed by disorder and mistrust. God couldn't protect them because they were murmuring and speaking against God again. You know, this God of yours is a dick. That's what they were saying. And the devil's like, I'm going to send some serpents. Or maybe just naturally, there were some snakes that came in and started biting people. But God provided a way so that those who got bit, look at the snake, metal snake that they made in the desert, they didn't die. So this distinction here, guys, matters because it shapes how believers understand divine correction. In the King James wording, suffering can sound like something God inflicts to teach a lesson. In the Ethiopian wording, suffering sounds like a result of broken trust, with God intervening to preserve life. I'm not making this stuff up. This is my research. Both records affirm the same reality. People die. Healing is offered. Nothing is softened here. But what differs is whether God is heard as the source of harm or as the source of rescue within harm. Why would he send snakes to bite them all up after he gives them manna bread, after they sacrifice all their cattle because they continue to sin? For believers, this passage often determines whether repentance is motivated by terror or by recognition. One reading can teach fear of God's reactions. The other teaches attentiveness to God's provision, even in failure. Meaning they were murmuring, somehow the snakes came in. It doesn't say God did it. Numbers does not end this scene in death. It ends in healing. The serpent on the standard becomes a focal point of trust. The people are not asked to fight or flee, but to look and live. And perhaps that serpent steel thing that was hanging in the air, perhaps when the serpents saw that, they're like, there's a bigger one in this area, and then they laughed. Maybe there wasn't any symbology behind it at all. Maybe it was just when the snakes saw it in their natural form, they go, that one's going to eat us, let's go. So the moment teaches that correction does not negate care. God does not abandon the people to what threatens them. He provides a way through it. Some died, yes, but it wasn't God's fault. How that provision is voiced determines whether believers remember this scene as punishment, survived, or mercy revealed in the midst of consequence. The next passage concerning God's sovereignty over speech and intention, Balaam, which is Baal, is not an Israelite prophet, yet God uses him to speak blessings. Oh, Balaam, not Baal. Sorry. Balaam. Balaam. Okay, he's not an Israelite prophet, yet God uses him to speak blessings. Now, the way this moment is voiced determines whether God is heard as coercing obedience through force or declaring truth that cannot be reversed by human intent. Now, in King James Bible, Numbers 23:19 through 20, it reads, God is not a man that he should lie, neither the son of man that he should repent. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good? It continues, behold, I have received commandment to bless, and he hath blessed, and I cannot reverse it. Now, the language emphasizes compulsion. Balaam speaks because he has received a commandment. Blessing sounds enforced, and God's will appears as something imposed that overrides human agency. Later in Numbers in the King James, it says, 24:1, and when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he went not, as at other times, to seek for enchantments. Now, the implication is that God's will suppresses alternative spiritual actions by force of authority. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, Numbers 23:19 through 20, it reads, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. What he has said, will he not do? What he has spoken, will he not fulfill? Behold, I have been instructed to bless, he has blessed, and I cannot change it. The difference here lies in posture. Instructed replaces received commandment. Cannot change it replaces cannot reverse it. See how subtle this stuff is, and nobody would pick up on it? The blessing is not forced speech. It's alignment with an unchangeable truth already spoken. Then it follows in Numbers 24:1 in the Ethiopian record. When Balaam saw that it was good before the Lord to bless Israel, he did not turn again to seek divination. Well, the shift here matters. Balaam seizes enchantment not because he is restrained, but because he recognizes that resistance is futile against the truth, not against power. So this distinction matters because it shapes how believers understand God's sovereignty. In the King James wording, God's will can sound like coercion that overrides intent. In the Ethiopian wording, God's will sounds like declared reality that human intent cannot undo. Both records affirm the same truth. Israel is blessed. Nothing can curse what God has blessed. What differs here is whether God's authority is heard as overpowering speech or as truth that stands regardless of opposition. Pretty quiet in this church. For believers, this passage teaches whether God must force outcomes into place or whether his word simply is. One reading can make sovereignty feel heavy-handed. The other preserves sovereignty as certainty without violence. So Numbers does not show God wrestling with curses. It shows God speaking blessings that cannot be negated. Balaam's role exposes the difference between manipulation and alignment. How that exposure is voiced really determines whether believers fear God's control or trust the stability of his word. This moment anchors the book's theology of promise. What God blesses remains blessed, not because he crushes resistance, but because truth does not require enforcement to endure. This next movement of Numbers, this next scripture, is not failure, but succession. After rebellion, fear, loss, and correction, God ensures that the promise continues forward. The way this transition is voiced really determines whether God is heard as closing the door in disappointment or deliberately preserving the future. In the King James Bible, Numbers 27:12 through 14 records God saying to Moses, this is King James, "Get thee up into this Mount Abiram, and see the land which I have given unto the children of Israel. And when thou hast seen it, thou also shalt be gathered unto thy people, as Aaron thy brother was gathered. For ye rebelled against my commandments in the desert of Zin, to sanctify me at the water before their eyes." Now, the language emphasis here is loss and finality. Moses is reminded of failure immediately after being showed the land. What a great God. Read devotionally under this angry God, the moment can totally sound like a closing judgment rather than just a simple transition. But in the passage of he actually goes into it more. The passage actually continues in King James in Numbers 27:15 through 17, which says, "And Moses spake unto the Lord, saying, Let the Lord set a man over the congregation, which may go out before them, and which may go in before them, that the congregation of the Lord be not as sheep which have no shepherd." So Moses' concern is not his own loss, but continuity of care after he is dead. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record, the same exchange reads, "Go up into the Mount Abiram and see the land that I have given to the children of Israel. And when you have seen it, you shall be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother was gathered, because you did not trust me at the waters of Meribah." The consequence here is stated, but without emotional emphasis. The focus remains on role and representation, not on condemnation. Then it follows in Numbers 27:15 through 17 in the Ethiopian record. "And Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, Let the Lord appoint a man over the congregation, who will go out before them and come in before them, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd." Now, the tone is steady and forward-looking. You couldn't tell the difference if you weren't paying attention. Succession is not punishment. It's actually preservation. This distinction matters because it shapes how believers understand endings. In the King James wording, leadership transition can sound like consequence emphasis. In the Ethiopian wording, leadership transition sounds like stewardship ensured. Both records affirm the same truth. Moses will not enter the land. Joshua is going to lead it. Nothing is softened here, but what differs is whether the final emphasis rests on failure remembered or future protected. For believers, this passage often determines whether failure ends purpose or redirects it. Moses does not lose relationship. He does not lose voice. He loses a role because representation matters. But the people do not lose guidance. Moses knows he made the mistake by hitting that rock twice. Basically, he has to represent God, and that's what the people thought that God was, an angry God. Well, look, you hit that twice, and God's like, dude, why'd you do that? You're making me look like an angry God. And Moses probably turned around and said, well, they're going to probably write you up like that too in the future in some empire. Got to be like, yeah, true. Word. Numbers does not end with rejection. It ends with continuity, that the people will have a shepherd. That's Jesus. God ensures that his people are not left shepherdless, even when correction has been necessary. So that closing moment confirms what the entire book has been teaching all along, that we were not given because our language makes him angry. God does not abandon his people when fear and failure appear. He governs through them, corrects them, and preserves the promise beyond individual limitation. And this explains this entire angry God that we've been taught in the Old Testament. And how that preservation is voiced really determines whether Numbers is remembered as a book of loss or as a book of faithful governance under pressure. Now, to conclude, Numbers does not reveal a God who grows weary of his people. It reveals a God who continues to govern them through fear, failure, and delay without abandoning his promise. What this examination really shows is that the harshness often associated with numbers arises less from events themselves and more from how those events are voiced through language. Across both records, the pattern remains consistent. God organizes before he corrects. He blesses before complaints erupts. He intervenes when disorder threatens the whole. He disciplines leaders without dissolving relationship. He preserves continuity even when individuals fail. Nothing essential is really removed in either canon, but where differences appear, they occur in tone and emphasis. Certain wordings can make God sound emotionally reactive, easily provoked, and quick to punish. Other wordings preserve sequence, restraint, and intention, allowing God's actions to be heard as governance rather than outburst. That distinction matters deeply for believers learning how to endure correction. So Numbers does not teach that complaint automatically invites destruction. It teaches that unchecked fear and rebellion unravel communal order and must be addressed so it doesn't hurt other people. Then judgment appears, but it's bounded. Intercession still works, healing still follows, blessings is never withdrawn as posture, even when consequence is present. So this book answers a quiet question that many believers carry. What happens when faith falters after deliverance? Well, Numbers shows that God does not revoke his covenant. He continues to lead, correct, and provide a future beyond the failure of one generation. The wilderness is not a punishment chamber. It is a classroom where trust is tested and learned slowly. How God is heard speaking is that space determines whether believers learn fear of failure or endurance under discipline. This examination does not excuse rebellion or minimize consequence. It simply allows the words to reveal whether God governs like an offended ruler or like a faithful shepherd guiding a frightened people through formation. And Numbers ends not with rejection, but with succession. Not with abandonment, but with preservation. The promise outlives the fear. And when the language preserves that truth, the book no longer terrifies people. It just instructs them. And this is how the Ethiopian people read that book. So my work continues. Each book clarifies the same question. Does the language handed to believers teach them to hide from God or to keep walking with him even when the road becomes long and difficult? Pretty cool stuff. We've been handed a bill of goods with the King James Bible. Well, I'm not putting blame. We can simply say that language changes the tone of God. I prefer to read the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox 5th, 6th century scrolls in English than the King James, because it makes me happier knowing that God's got my back and he's not watching me make errors so he can open up the ground or send fire outside of my house because I'm not doing things correctly. Surfer Wife says, so eye-opening this is, and says the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox God sounds more like Jesus like ever before. Right. And what we're doing right now, this work, I think it's going to change Christianity for the good. Because of all the times that needed this truth, right now is needed. Think about it. Trump worships that angry God, or he says he's Christian. He follows the Catholic Church and the Vatican and all of theirs, and they all worship that angry God, and they do everything upside down. But what we have here is the most honest truth I can find to hand to you guys to say, look, this is my research. This is what I found. Wasn't easy doing it, but as we've got to here, we've been through all the emotions, we've been through all of the books, we've been through so many interesting things that happened, especially the volcano that blew up in the direction of where I believe the Cave of Treasures is. There's so much that we don't know. And God even says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. Well, we are his people, all of us, his beloved. And we're not the ones on trial here. It's the fallen angels. And as soon as God can correct that, then the trial, and then we finally all have all the information. And then we can live with him without all of this pain and suffering and crap that all started under his first creation. God loves you unconditionally. God is love, which means love came first before you. That means you're getting a secondhand portion of love, and you'll never understand his love because it's more, and it always will be more. And I don't know about you, but that comforts me. We'll see you tomorrow.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.